answer is yes, but not in the form that we know. Or not quite the form that we know. Several things. To go back, first of all, I think you have to look at Chinese politics, and indeed China as a whole, through, and I would say this, wouldn't I, having written this book, first of all through a historical perspective. If you start in the middle of the 19th century, China had 125 years of the worst time any country has ever had for such a protracted period in the history of the world, which is a bold kind of statement. But, and this is not the Opium Wars and the horrible foreigners coming into China, who were pretty horrible, but I would argue were quite marginal, actually, for China for most of the time. You have at the moment a discourse, the historical discourse in China is the period of the century of humiliation, as it's heard. And above the nasty foreigners, and above all the horrible British, are blamed for everything that went wrong in China from the First Opium War, 1834, through to whenever you think things started getting better. There's some truth in this, but it's quite a small part of the story in the end. Because if I say that, I'm immediately classed with Neil Ferguson and others as a neo-imperialist historian trying to set things right for my paymasters in Whitehall. But in fact, if you look at the history, yes, you had the Brits with the Opium War in the name of free trade in the 1830s and 40s, but in the 1850 is the date. A man whose alleged photograph, since we have this, I can hold up to you, but whether he looked anything like this, nobody knows. Hong, I can't remember where it is, somewhere here. He was a school teacher in southern China on the edge of what is now Guangdong province. He failed the imperial examination for civil service 3 times, went back to his village and had some kind of depressive fit, where he raved around his house, writing on the wall, writing slogans on the wall, and had this vision that he had been taken up to heaven, where he had met a very tall man with a long grey beard and a thick belt, who introduced him to his son, and then said his mission in life of Hong was to return to Earth and to eradicate the demons who were destroying China. Hong went back to Earth, woke up from his fit, let's say, and a little while later was in Canton, which was the only port open to foreigners in China at that time, and there was a Christian missionary who handed out tracts with extracts from the Bible, translated into Chinese. And Hong read these and decided that the tall man with the long grey beard and the big belt was the Christian God, that he, Hong, was the son of the Christian God and the brother of Jesus, and that the mission he had been given was to drive out the emperor, the imperial dynasty of the Qing, which was ruling China, and which of course was not Chinese at all. It came from Manchuria. It was Manchus who conquered China in 1644. So Hong launched what was called the Taiping movement, which is to seek a heavenly kingdom to be established in China. And it was a mixture of kind of distorted Christian treatment and proto-communist treatment. All land was to be shared out, there was to be equality of the sexes, the rich were all to be killed, etc., etc., etc. And the Qing were to be driven out of China. This was extraordinarily, I mean, it's hardly known about the Taiping, as they were called now, but that was extraordinarily successful. They marched up their armies, they had some excellent generals. They took the imperial southern capital of Nanjing, and they occupied a great deal of southern China. The war went on for about 15, 16 years, probably 20 million people were killed, most of the provinces of China were affected. This was, huge, at the same time as the American Civil War, but even more destructive. At the same time, in eastern China, Shandong province, a group of, well, they were really bandits, called the Nian, who were very good horsemen. There were about 2 million of them. They also rose in revolt against the imperial house. In the far west of China, Xinjiang, a Muslim leader, Yaqub Beg, declared an independent kingdom and again seceded from China. And in the southwest, in Yunnan, the Muslims set up the kingdom of Dali. So you had this complete China falling to bits, as it were, and this was not helped by the fact that the foreigners at this point, the British and the French, decided that the Chinese weren't living up to the Treaty of Nanjing, which had ended the first Opium War, and they marched on Beijing, occupied burnt down the Summer Palace, the famous destruction there, and the emperor hightailed it off to the imperial hunting estate in Jehol, to the north of China, north of Beijing, where he lay dying. And he died. He hadn't named his successor. Eventually he did on his deathbed, and one of these stories, is it true or not? It's too good not to be true, or not to be retold. His favourite concubine, who had his only son, came in and said, "What's to happen to our boy?" And the emperor said, "He's the next emperor," and turned over and died. But anyway, you had fighting round the throne for the succession. So you had this country in complete chaos there. This was all ended around 1870 by a series of Chinese gentry generals who raised armies, absolute savage warfare, and put down all these revolts one by one. But the imperial house had lost a lot of its credibility because it had to delegate responsibility, basically, for saving China to the rural gentry. So things went downhill for the dynasty, and this is after 2,000 years of the empire. Then you had the Japanese who invaded China in 1894-5, a war which the Chinese were sure they were going to win, and they were completely devastated by the Japanese. Their fleet was destroyed, their army was destroyed, they had to pay a huge indemnity, give up large amounts of Manchuria. Then you had the Boxer rising in defence of the dynasty. It wasn't a rebellion, it was a rising in defence of the dynasty against the foreigners. The Dowager Empress threw in her lot with the Boxers, and of course that brought another foreign expedition, which, after the legation siege in Beijing, which further humiliated the empire. So fast forward, 1911, army revolt against the dynasty. 1912, the last emperor abdicates. 10-year a period of about 3 months when China was theoretically a democratic republic, but then a military strongman took over. He died, 10 years of warlordism. Then Chiang Kai-shek established the Nationalist Republic, but it was always, there was a regional rebellion every year. The Japanese came back, took Manchuria, full-scale war from 1937 to 45. As soon as that's over, civil war between the communists and the nationalists. The communists win. Then you get a brief period of, not, you can call it calm, because the land reform was not calm in China, but relative calm. And then from 1955, Mao starts going mad. And you have the 100 Flowers and the anti-rightist campaign there, with maybe 4 million people persecuted in some way or other. Then you have the Great Leap Forward, complete economic failure, followed by a famine, which by the latest accounts, there's just been a very good book by Frank Cotter on this, 45 million people died in the famine, followed by 10 years of the Cultural Revolution. So that is a period which makes what has happened since 1978, since Deng Xiaoping took over and launched economic reform, seem like the best time China has had for 125 years. And you have to look at the present regime for all its many, many faults in the light of that past. And when the Communist Party says that it offers stability and unity, that means something in China in a way that it doesn't mean something in most countries, particularly in the West. In Britain, so what? You know, stability, yes, we have riots, but there's no instability of the kind China had, or the breaking up of the Union. So I'm not defending the system in any way, but you have to put everything into that context. You also have to take into context, when you look at the material improvements since 1978, the fact that at the end of the Cultural Revolution, China was basically bankrupt. It didn't work, it had fallen to bits. Mao had even almost managed to destroy the Communist Party. In Guangdong province, 70% of young men who were being called up for the army were refused because they were so weak or so small. The whole, national food had been short for 10 years.
Guangdong province is where the big
now, where subsequently, I'm just saying this was a country completely on its knees. And Deng Xiaoping took the initiative, saw that China needed an economic shot in the arm, but most importantly, did not ever really envisage political liberalisation. Indeed, Deng saw economic reform and the growth of economic wealth and power as a means of strengthening the Communist Party, because it would be Communist Party which brought China its new material wealth, and that is again absolutely vital. Hu Jintao, the present leader, when the stimulus package was launched in 2008 to counter the big downturn in the economy then, is said to have said this will be the ultimate test of the Communist Party's ability to rule China. And that's it. Delivering growth equals communist continuing rule. And you have to see all Chinese politics and everything that's done in that context there. Now, Deng, if you look politically, we had Mao, which was the rule of one man, going increasingly crazy, and he was crazy towards the end, I don't think there's any doubt about that. You then had Deng Xiaoping, who was the ultimate survivor, who'd become a communist when he was a student in France in the 1920s, and spent his whole life with the Communist Party. He'd been in clandestinity, he'd been a political commissar during the Civil War, he'd survived Mao, he'd been purged 3 times, and he always came like a doll that you knock over and it comes back again. And he was dedicated to Communist Party power. He saw, as I say, economic reform as the means of doing that. That all worked more or less in the early mid-80s. By the late 1980s, the corruption, the inflation, the disjunction which had come from economic growth was so great that they set off the famous protests of the spring of 1989, and as Charles, there's a very good book, The Tiananmen Papers, which I think is genuine, or I've used it and referred to it, which is the inside paper of the leadership discussions at that point. And in the end, there was the reformist Communist Party secretary, Zhou Zhang, and there were reformists around, but in the end, Deng bypassed the Communist Party, he bypassed the Politburo and the government. He called in the elders, as they were called, who were the old line veterans, and they basically said these young whippersnappers can't be allowed to threaten the achievements since the communist victory of 1949. In fact, one of them, known as Big Cannon Wang, who was an old PLA general, just said, what these young men need is a good period in the army. Send them out into the forest to fight, and then they'll learn what's what. We know that kind of discourse. So you had the massacres on June the 4th, 1989, which actually, although they were always known as the Tiananmen Square massacres, weren't in Tiananmen Square. And this is one of the terrible things in Chinese history, that the official Chinese lie is that hardly anybody, if anybody, was killed in Tiananmen Square itself. And that is probably actually true, because nearly all the students had left the square by the time the tanks went in. Where the killings took place was on the boulevard going down to Tiananmen Square, because incredibly, the ordinary citizens of Beijing had stopped the army twice. They just put up barricades of furniture. The soldiers, who were from outside Henan province mainly, had been told they were coming in to put down a black hand Japanese-American rising in Beijing. They came in, their tanks and armoured cars were stopped by barricades, and these ordinary Chinese came out and gave them ice creams and flowers and talked to them, and they were a bit not well, so they turned around and went back twice, and the third time they didn't, and they were tougher troops. They came through and just sprayed. You can still go down the boulevard, killed probably about 2,000 or 3,000 people who were just ordinary citizens sitting there. And the sign of the change in China, the Muxi interchange, where most of the killings took place, which was then, it's now an interchange over the ring road, then it was over a canal. I went to visit it on the anniversary, last anniversary event, and what have you got there? A glitzy shopping centre with an enormous picture of David Beckham advertising sunglasses. So, this is China remembers its history. After '89, the Conservatives took power for a little while and turned back economic reform, but then Deng, old man, quite sick, went to southern China, to Guangdong and Shenzhen, and announced we have to relaunch market reform, and everybody went along with him. So you then had, since then, the period of the really explosive Chinese growth, particularly since in the last 10 years of this century. And so economic, from one point of view, the country has been transformed, and I'll talk in a moment how the effects of that socially. But what has not changed is the politics of China. And basically, as I said, economic growth is used to solidify the one-party control of the Communist Party. So you have a disjunction between the economic reforms and the political system, where the Communist Party remains in absolute power. And this is a party of 70 million members, plus around 50 million in its youth league, so it's about a tenth of the population. It operates independently of the civilian government. The Standing Committee of the Politburo, which is the 9 men, and they are all men, who run China, nobody knows when they meet, where they meet, what they're doing. They're completely the system is opaque. The phrase Richard McGregor, the former Financial Times bureau chief, has written the best book about the Chinese Communist Party that came out last year, called simply The Party, and with a ringing endorsement from me on the cover. And I'd say he had this great phrase that somebody said to him, the Communist Party is like God. It is everywhere, you just can't see it. And that is very true. Every company in China has a Communist Party cell which can overrule big decisions. All intermediate institutions, going down to sports clubs, have a Communist Party presence in them. The Communist Party runs its own disciplinary organisation, which can pick up party members, and this is the 10% top people in China, can pick them up, hold them for 6 months in a secret location without charge, and then either hand them over to the civilian courts, having thrown them out of the party, or release them, very rarely. This is a really old-fashioned authoritarian party. It doesn't allow any political dissidents. We've had last year now, after the Arab Spring, a real clampdown on perceived dissidents. I mean, most of these people are human rights lawyers who are no threat at all, but who represent people whom the government doesn't want to be represented, basically, although it's perfectly, they're just following the law, but people whose land has been requisitioned by local authorities, who've been thrown out of their apartments, who have suffered from the one-child policy and abortions, etc., etc., etc. But these people have, about 24 of them have been picked up this year, and they're held in usually terrible situations. The word which you'll be familiar to from Latin America, the disappear, is now used in China of these people. They just disappear, and they come back, some of them, most of them, and are told not to say anything. And a few of them do talk a bit, and then they disappear again. There are some terrible cases going on at the moment of one woman lawyer who stood up for some people whose homes have been demolished arbitrarily, and she was taken in by the police and beaten up so badly that she's crippled, and she's been endlessly harassed. And the awful, ironic thing is that she is up on trial for attacking police officers because she's said to have stood up when she was arrested the last time, for example. So you've got that on the one hand. On the other hand, you've had Chinese society, and this is in a sense more important than the politics. Chinese society has evolved incredibly even over the last, I've been going to China for 17 years now, and even in that period, just walking in the streets, you can tell it, people talk much more freely. If you organise anything political or seen as being political, and everything is political, you'll be in trouble, there's no doubt. But on an individual basis, talking to people are really, I don't know what you found in your trips, are amazingly free there. And materialism has taken over in China with the perhaps questionable freedoms that brings. Freedom to travel, to buy things, to live your life as you want, so long as you keep out of organised politics. And of course, we're all materialists to a greater or lesser extent, but the incident, the person, the saying, which sums this up for me and a lot of people, is on a television dating show. They have dating shows on television in China. They also have talent shows, but most of them have been stopped because they don't like people voting. You know, the idea of the audience voting has been not approved of. But on a dating show in Jiangsu province, a young lady was asked, what are you going to look for in the panel of young men who are on you with dating show? She said, look, they would be quite straightforward. I'll tell you what I think. I'd rather cry in the back of a BMW than laugh on the back of a bicycle. And that's, mind you, I did say that to one of our colleagues in London. You'll guess who, a young lady, and she said, well, I'd probably say that too. So it's not uniquely Chinese there. But you've got this materialism, and this is building up individualism in China to a quite extraordinary extent, I find, at least in the big cities, right? It's much less so in the countryside when I go there. There are protests in China, nobody knows exactly how many, maybe 150,000 a year, demonstrations and protests. These are on one-issue subjects, everything from police brutality, suspicious deaths of people in police custody. A local newspaper in Hangzhou in eastern China got hold of a list of causes of death in police custody in the local area police station, and these included sleeping in a bad position, scratching acne, and this is how the police behave. So you get protests over that, all the way to bus fares, to environmental issues, to land being requisitioned, farmland for development by local authorities, corruption, etc., etc. And what is interesting is that in most of these cases of these protests that we've looked at trusted sources, the initial reaction from the local authorities is quite brutal. They send in the riot police, first of all. But if the protesters continue, and this comes to the attention of the provincial or the central authorities, they seek a settlement, almost always. There's an awareness at the higher levels in China that they're sitting on a social pressure cooker. And I don't know if you've read about it, but it's reported, it's called a village, a fishing village. It has about 20,000 people in it, in Wukan, in Guangdong province. About 13,000 of those basically went protested about the seizure of land by the local authorities. Who
That was just last month.
That was in December, yeah. They were going to sell it for development to a Hong Kong development firm. And the villagers basically cut off the village from, the police were outside, but they kept the police out. And they were more or less running this village autonomously themselves for 3 months. And they were quite media savvy. A British reporter from the Daily Telegraph heard about this, and he went there, and they suddenly realised, oh yeah, we get some media attention. And they set up a press centre, but very savvily, they put across a banner at the top saying, we are not rebels, we love China and the Communist Party. So you're saying this is not a political threat, please. And Wang Yang, who's the party secretary, the boss of Guangdong, when he got to hear about it, he sent in one of his deputies who reached an agreed settlement, which ended the land grab, diffused the situation, and the protest leader has now been made the village chief. So you can see that it's not, we have this image of...
But the leader of the original protest died in custody.
He died in custody. I should have mentioned, sorry, that 4 have been arrested by the local authorities, and 1 had died in custody.
He went to talk to them to negotiate.
Yeah, and then they negotiated. But that was the local authorities. What I'm saying is when it gets higher up, you get a different reaction, which is a sign that the more intelligent senior people know that there are big problems there. So you've got this social thing. Now, to come back to the politics, the Communist Party renews its leadership every 10 years now. In 2002, Jiang Zemin stepped down as party secretary, somewhat reluctantly, and handed over to Hu Jintao, who'd been groomed for the job ever since Deng Xiaoping marked him out in 1989 as a coming young man for the way he put down a revolt in Tibet at the time. And Hu Jintao took over, and the most important job in China is that of Communist Party General Secretary, which he took. He then became state president. People often refer to Hu in the West as President Hu, but that is not the most important job. The important job is Party Secretary Hu. He took over, and Wen Jiabao became Prime Minister the following year in 2003. Hu is a absolute dyed-in-the-wool Communist Party bureaucrat. He's like a puppet, almost, there. He's the perfect apparatchik. Wen is more interesting. He has a history. He was in Tiananmen Square with the Reformist Party leader about a week before the tanks went in, and was photographed when the party leader said, who was a reformist, and said to the students, for goodness sake, go back to your campus, I've come too late, terrible things are going to happen. But Wen survived that. He ingratiated himself with Jiang Zemin and is apparently an extremely efficient administrator. He's been prime minister. So these two have been at the top of the Chinese system, of the party and the government, which comes under the party, since 2002-2003. They will step down in, they'll step down from their party posts in October or possibly November of this year, when the party congress meets again. And then the National People's Congress, the legislature, will meet the following March 2013, at which point there will be a new Prime Minister and a new state president. So we're getting the change of the generation taking place now. This is the biggest transition of organised power, the organised transition of power China has ever seen. It's predicated on two rules. One is you can't hold a top job if you're aged over 68, and the second is you have to resign, you have to step down after 10 years in one of the top jobs. And that will apply to 6 of the 9 members of the Standing Committee of the Politburo this October, and then next year. So we're going to get, it's a huge generation, it's the 50-year-olds coming in and the late 60-year-olds going out. And those 50-year-olds will hang on for another 10 years unless something goes very wrong indeed.
Is there a qualitative change in this leadership?
Well, that's the interesting thing. The answer, to be entirely honest, is, if I have to give an answer, the answer is no, because they've all come up through the Communist Party, and that's how they get their top job. And their basic aim is the same, to keep the Communist Party in power and maintain a sustainable, a good level of growth, which will do that. The answer really is we don't know. Xi Jinping, who will become party leader, we're almost certain of this, because the way you know, it's like some kind of televised show. The way you know the order of seniority in the Chinese Communist Party is at the party congress every 5 years. The Central Committee, there are 300 members of the Central Committee, 200 of them have a vote. They vote or select, how it's done we don't know, for the Politburo. And the 9 top people in the voting make up the Standing Committee of the Politburo, which is the supreme decision-making organ in China. And at the party congress, at the end, these members of the Politburo step out onto the stage in the Great Hall of the People in the order of the voting. So you know who's number 1, who's number 2. And how we know that Xi Jinping is going to come out is the likely next party leader, is he was the first member of the new 5th generation to step onto the stage, ahead of Hu Jintao's protege, Li Keqiang, who walked out 7th, whereas Xi was 6th, he walked out. But he has spent his whole life in the Communist Party. His father was a vice premier under Mao, was then purged during the Cultural Revolution, came back and ran Guangdong for Deng Xiaoping, and Xi, the son, has risen in the coastal provinces to the top. You ask people in Beijing, how did he get the top job? And the answer is everybody is comfortable with him. He's friends with everyone. He's not seen as an ambitious dictator, autocrat. That is very healthy in many ways. We're getting away from the Mao era, mad autocracy. But it makes hard decision-making difficult, because Hu Jintao has already started a system, and Xi will probably continue it, where you have consensus leadership at the top. The top man is like a company chairman, a non-executive chairman, whose board, if you like, is the other 8 members of the Politburo, of the Standing Committee of the Politburo, plus the representatives of the Commerce Ministry for exports, the Energy Ministry, the security apparatus, the propaganda and ideological apparatus, the energy lobby, etc., etc., etc. And they're combined, and the People's Liberation Army, of course, which is playing probably a bigger political role than it used to. So the leaders they work by consensus. And you can see this, they all have to be together, they don't do conference calls, they all have to be in the room, round the table, making decisions. And this makes decision-making very unwieldy in China. When there's a real threat, as in 2008, to the economy, they can react with big measures. But lots of other measures, and I'll come to this, one of the last 2 things I'll say, is that although Deng Xiaoping liberalised the market in farm products and manufactured goods, China is still a state run by the state, if you like, an economy run by the state. This is still a command economy. It's not always very efficient, and it has regional wrinkles in it, but all land belongs to the state. Labour movement is controlled because you are registered in your village of birth, and that is the only place where you can get health, education, and welfare and pensions, and buy property. If you're a migrant worker living in Guangdong, working in Guangdong, you can't go to the hospital, you can't send your children to school, and you can't buy property. It's a 2-tier system run by the state for security reasons. Capital markets and the currency are all controlled. Interest rates are controlled centrally. Credit policy is run by loan quotas dictated from the top. Water and energy prices are controlled controlled at levels far below anything that would bring a market return on investment. And this is mad in a country which is short of water and energy. The rule of law is very weak in China. So you've still got this lack of the structural reforms which have been avoided for the last 10 years. And the question going forward is whether Xi Jinping and the people around him will have the will and the guts and the political clout to do something about this. If they do, China can continue on quite a healthy path. If they don't, the danger is the whole machine may seize up at some point. So I'm quite bullish for the short term, but long term trouble.
Well, do you foresee, or could you identify any issues under which the Standing Committee of the Politburo, or the Politburo itself, would enter into fundamental disagreement?
If inflation took off again in China, and inflation is a problem in China for two reasons. They've had very low inflation for most of this decade, 1-2%. But there's now a food crisis. Sorry, this isn't a crisis, but there is the potential for a food crisis in China because wages have been pushed up, the middle class is eating a much more varied diet, and agriculture is very backward and cannot keep up with food demand. They've had 6 good harvests. They don't want to import food, but there could be a real crisis there. That would feed through into inflation, which we've already seen twice in the last 3 years, spiking up to 6-7%, which is very high for China. If you got high inflation, there would be an argument about what to do about it, basically, there, and how to. The other question would be a crisis in foreign relations. The extent to which China, if say, I would say World War III, but North Korea, whether China should take a proactive forward policy towards that, whether China should always pursue the kind of low-profile foreign policy which Deng Xiaoping always said.
Is it your view, I mean, this is a suspicion of mine, that the Chinese really are deeply involved in the North Korean nuclear program? In the sense that they run it, basically.
They don't run it, they wish they did run it. That's the trouble. They've been involved in it, but it's gone out of their control. I've spoken to the former Chinese ambassador in North Korea, who's now in London, and he more or less says, the trouble with North Korea is we thought we controlled them, and we don't control them as much. Mind you, he would say that, wouldn't he? But the main involvement is in the army. It's the PLA with the North Korean army. And you may say that is the nuclear. Yeah. So, there is one of the big questions is, if North Korea starts to implode, whether the Chinese arm, the PLA, has got enough clout with the North Korean army to basically have a military coup, a Chinese-led military coup.
I mean, against whom?
Well, I mean, if the economy completely collapsed and everything, there were riots, the country was completely imploding, and 2 million refugees were crossing the border. I'm not an expert on Korea, so I don't know. The other thing which could cause a serious problem in China is the environment now, because the environmental problem has become so huge in China. Air pollution, water pollution, lead poisoning from smelters in the ground, etc., etc., etc. Food safety, which is a real scandal. All the standards in China, all that broader environment and social environment is a problem, and the difficulty there is that if you're going to do anything about that, you've got to accept lower growth. And that is a debate which is going on in China. Whether it's going on at the top level, I don't know.
Yeah. I'd like to just ask you about my experience.
If you'll excuse me, I'll take that.
Please. We were in Xi'an, which is the ancient capital of China. It was the capital of China for over 1,000 years. It is where the famous terracotta warriors were found nearby. I was enormously, they are building apartment buildings like mad. There is this great statue of the Emperor Qin, pointing out, and he's pointing out to these apartment buildings. There are literally dozens of these apartments, and yet...
You get, sorry, if I can bring in Chengdu in Western China.
Yeah.
It's wonderful. There's this enormous boulevard, 5 lanes on either side, full of Vuitton, Prada, Gucci, da-da-da, and you get to the end of it, and what's there? A huge white statue of Mao pointing at the luxury stores, exactly the same kind of thing. Sorry.
What impressed me is that the water table, in Portuguese, lençol freático, está descendo.
Yep.
They have, there's a desperate shortage of water. The ground is sinking.
Yep.
And I was trying to find out, how could they justify all of this huge construction when they're building apartment buildings for people for whom there's no water? And
It's coming. When they say the water is coming.
Well, I'll tell you about that in a minute. I'll tell you where it's coming from.
That's what they say. The answer is that.
But the thing, I had an interpreter running around with me, or some guy, and I asked if I could talk to the municipal officials to find out how they can explain this. And the guy was just absolutely shocked. It's just impossible to do in China.
So I told you yesterday.
You cannot talk to the government. We had very good fortune for 2 reasons. One, because a friend of mine here in Brazil is the head of a big commodities firm, which has an apple juice crushing plant in the interior of Shanxi Province, and they were able to take us around. And after a lot of negotiation, a lot of bargaining, we were able to visit some schools. And the other thing, because the Brazilian ambassador became a friend of ours, and he was able to get an audience with the Water Resources Ministry. And there was a very nice woman at the water who was able to open a few doors for us. Otherwise, our trip to China would have been a total loss, because you cannot talk to people. And you have the foreigners all talking amongst themselves, and very few of them know what's going on.
And you have, on water, the interesting water, we talked about the environment. You're in Xi'an, but the real water, there's a water crisis around Beijing at the moment, where the water table is falling by about 1 meter a year. It's absolutely enormous in some places. And where I saw this, I don't know how you do this, if you're an expert on water, you'll be able to tell me, but the latest wells drilled go so deep that the water being brought up is 50,000 years old. I don't know how you date water, but this is the thing. And the trouble there is that the water is being taken from farmlands and reservoirs for Beijing, for exactly these apartments, and Tianjin, which is the port city near Beijing, which is hugely developed. And you've got, I can't remember the figure, it's in my new book somewhere, the amount of water used in Beijing on golf courses and bathhouses every day is absolutely enormous there. So water is cheap in China because it's sold at 1/4, 25% of the proper rate according to the World Bank's estimate for countries at China's level. So you get huge wastage of water, agriculturally particularly, because it's so cheap, and they won't introduce market mechanisms for water. So water, and then it is coming. There is a project, there's been a project for 30 years, 40 years, to bring water from southern China, where there's a lot of water, or there was a lot of water, to the north, to Xi'an and to the Beijing region, the south-north water thing. The trouble is, first of all, this goes through some enormous mountains, and it's engineering. It's practically impossible to drive the channels through there. Secondly, the water in those rivers south of the Yellow River, the water level is dropping. The Yangtze because of the Three Gorges Dam, other places because of overuse. Thirdly, the water in a lot of those rivers, like the Kwai River in Anhui province in eastern China, is so filthy that they did bring some water up the route of the Old Grand Canal to Tianjin, and they've out to build 300 water purification plants in Tianjin.
We spoke with
That's
with the engineer in the pumping station in Jiangsu at the beginning of the Grand Canal is one of the great engineering projects of human history. It goes back nearly 2,000 years.
Well, the real one's about 1,000.
But it is it was basically done by the emperors to bring grain to the north so that they could feed the armies which were on the frontier trying to defend China against the Mongol invaders. And this, so we were at this pumping station. The chief engineer of the pumping station said that half of the south-north water transfer project is the largest hydraulic project in human history. Some numbers say that it will cost $50 to $60 billion. But the engineer said that half of the cost will be in water purification of water, because it's so polluted.
And then you've got water supplies, and something since we're on water, to the kind of places you were visiting, the urban centres, which are being developed very fast in China. And water, the supply of clean water to them is non-existent outside the biggest, outside Beijing, Shanghai, and so on and so on. There are 180 Chinese cities, I think that's the number I remember, which we haven't discussed too, but they take their drinking water for drinking directly from rivers into which raw sewage goes. So you don't drink water out of the tap. Everything is like, go anywhere in China and there's a kettle to boil the water, and you keep it on the go the whole time, and so on and so on. So water, that's where the problem of speaking to officials. This is this is part of the whole disjunction that I was referring to between the political system and the social system. That in society now, people, particularly younger people, are used to just talking around, seeing television, watching foreign films, they're on social networks the whole time. Twitter is not allowed, but there are Chinese equivalents. Internet, you can get through Hong Kong or anything you like, whatever the censors say, on the one side. And on the other side, you've got the media, which is all owned by the state and run by the state, or the Communist Party, which with 3 or 4 extremely laudable exceptions, follows the party line, to the extent where one of the jokes on China Watchers is, when there's a big event, a big domestic political event, you can find the front pages of about 50 Chinese newspapers are exactly the same, with the same photographs, the same headlines, everything this is dictated from the centre. I have a source who sends me indirectly through a couple of cards instructions issued by the state censorship office, and they're extraordinary. I mean, it's micromanage things. Everything from do not report the traffic accident on the highway out of Beijing. Do not report a fire at a hospital. Do not report a plan to merge 2 schools together. It's something you wonder what's about this. And then you get other cases in it, which are fascinating. Like, there was one before Christmas. Do not report the case of the man who was executed in Henan province, who was executed 14 years ago, but has been resurrected. I'd love to know what the story is. I mean, as a journalist, I would love to know. And then I was referring to this earlier with my colleagues. One of them, when the railway minister Liu, was sacked a year ago over having spent far too much money on the high-speed train for political reasons and for corruption. The instruction came, do not make a big thing of Minister Liu's dismissal or mention his 18 mistresses. It was supposed we knew of it. One of the censors is giving us news all the time. But there is this desire to control, and it is said that the reason that China clamped down on Google about, 2 years ago now, was that the man who, in the standing committee of the Politburo, who was in charge of information and ideology, the two go together, propaganda and information. They call it propaganda, but it means the whole information system there. He was at an internet fair, and he sat down. He sat down at a computer, and somebody said, showed him Google. He'd never apparently seen a search engine. He said, oh, that's very interesting, put in my name. So his name was punched in, and all these critical articles from media about him came up, and next day Google was in trouble. So there is this desperate attempt to control media, and at the annual party plenum last October, everybody had been thinking, well, the economy is facing challenges and difficulties, there's the big political transition coming up, that's what they'll decide about. No, what the announcement was that China must improve its control of culture. And politics and culture are very close together in China. And the result of that was that Hu Jintao made a speech which could have come straight out of the 1950s or 60s, saying that there was a Western plot to destabilize China by distorting its media. And the authorities must take stronger control, and just over the new year, television stations in China were told to run only a quarter of the entertainment shows they'd run before. They were running too much entertainment.
Well, given the resource problem, let's say the water problem, given the pollution problem, the inflation problem, the food problem, what do you think the chances of the Communist Party leadership maintaining unity?
I think they will, because the more difficult things get, the more they will keep unity. In fact, and they look back to the Soviet Union, and they say the fatal thing, three things were fatal in the Soviet Union. It's like four things were fatal. First of all, the Soviet Union didn't get into the global economy there. Secondly, the Soviet Union got into an arms race with the United States, and they don't want to do that. But thirdly, the Soviet Union allowed debate. There was debate at the top under Gorbachev, and that was the fatal thing. And if you refer to, there was a moment, this is a long time ago now, in the 1990s, when an American editor with Zhuangzi, who was the Prime Minister of China, and who was shaking things up and changing things a lot, the editor of the Boston Globe looked at him and said, so, Mr. Zhu, do you think you are China's Gorbachev? And the look on Zhu's face was, it's the worst thing you could be accused of. So they will keep unity, a facade unity anyway. One of their great strengths is, first of all, the history I talked about. Secondly, that they have delivered a China in which most people are better off and individually freer than they were before. But thirdly, there is no alternative.
I just finished reading the book by Mao's doctor.
Yeah.
And which, I don't know what you think of that book. I know you quoted the book, but the intimacies of the leadership, what happened, things changing on a whim. Just major people.
There was,
people destroyed on
absolutely.
And these various. You get the feeling that this is a very volatile organization. This is not I'm sure that the Communist Party has evolved from Mao's time from now, but there seems to be something in the DNA which is not really.
I would say I think it's changed. Mao, it was personal rule under Mao, and as you say, it was volatile. He would suddenly turn against someone. He would like someone, put them forward. There were all the cliques and factions around him. There was his wife. There was the mad general Lin Biao, who was afraid of air and water, had phobias against moving air and water, which made life rather difficult for him in lots of ways. But he was Mao's successor for a while before his son tried a coup, and it all fell to bits. And this mad, nobody dared to question Mao in any way. And this is not a terrible personal story, but it's indicative. Buyibo, who was the finance minister and industry minister at one point, and was Mao's favourite swimming companion. And there is this story which is attested to. It's too good to be. You don't believe it in a sense, but a number of reliable sources have attested to it, that they were discussing during the Great Leap Forward, when the whole thing was produce. And it's rather touching now. The aim was to overtake Britain economically in 10 years. Now, they've done that rather good. But they were swimming, Bo and Mao, and talking about steel production. and the stenographers, the secretaries, were running up and down trying to take down the words. And at some point, Mao said something like, well, let's double back, meaning double and do another lap. This was taken down as double. And so steel production targets were double. It was mad. There was complete madness there. If that wasn't literally true, that kind of thing did happen. You had, during the Great Leap Forward, even Mao said at one point, you have to be careful of exaggeration. And that was after the party newspapers all ran photographs. The new super Chinese wheat was so wonderful, and it was growing so closely together that children could jump up and down on top of it, like a trampoline. And there were doctored photographs of children doing this on top of the wheat. And you had to believe, this was a completely mad period there. But I think since then, China has the party has institutionalized itself much more. We don't know what goes on behind the scenes, of course, but I don't think that Hu Jintao and Xi Jinping are going to behave in that way, because it's just the thing has evolved there.
Let me just ask you, a personal and professional question. What is it like to run a economic consultancy in China? They control your contact with the government. They control your visas. What can you say?
We keep well below the radar. That's to say, nobody knows what we are. They don't understand the idea of it. We do independent research, top-down, big policy, economy, and then sectors. They don't know who we are, what we do. People don't understand us.
But they have to give you a visa, and they find out.
They get a visa, yeah.
But they find out.
I don't say exactly what I'm doing when I get the visa. I just say business, or I sometimes used to say unemployed.
You get a visa as a journalist, or as
no, never. Even when I was in Hong Kong, editing the South China Morning Post, I would always put manager, because if you put journalist, your application goes through Xinhua, the state agency, and it can take 3 months. It's not necessarily you'll be kept out there. I haven't ever had any trouble so far. It can happen suddenly. I've got friends who, for absolutely, of course you're not told why, you suddenly don't get a visa. Yeah. I'm quite sure that, I'm not sure if I'm important enough to be followed, but probably, records are kept. And I must say that the service hotel that we use in Beijing is owned by the State Security Bureau. So I'm sure there are, it's said to be the safest hotel in Beijing because of that. I'm sure there are microphones, but you're careful what you say. And you're careful who you meet, certainly. But coming back to what you were saying, Norman, it's absolutely true. Where you get information in China, and you can get good information, is through individual contacts, talking to people, or semi-low level officials who are well connected and know what's going on. As soon as you get to anybody in a formal official position who is speaking to you as a formal official, you'll just get the script. Because they're the only people authorized to talk to you. But you can still, in China, because you can travel about freely now, outside military zones, obviously, you can actually see quite a lot. And it's the old journalistic thing, you're observing all the time. You can see, for instance, officially, the Chinese family is still very strong and the backbone of the nation. Go to villages in rural China, and you'll find a lot of villages where there's no one aged under 60 and over 14, because all the young adult, they've all left and gone to the city, and these are hollowed out places, and the family is all parents and grandchildren there. You look at these kind of things, look at the way things actually work, as against the way they're said to work. They work reasonably well. I'm not a China is going to collapse person, but China isn't going to rule the world either.
You folks have some questions?
Could you compare political stalemate together with economic growth with Germany in 1914?
Well, that is the comparison. No, that is a comparison often made. I don't think that China is expansionist in the way that lately, Imperial Germany was. That, or certainly, yes. That's the best comparison. The other comparison often made with the Communist Party is Japan during the era of the LDP dominance. And there, where again we've got one-party system. Although there you had elections, which was in China. You can compare it with Mexico under the PRI, although there wasn't economic growth at that point.
There's no economic
there
growth.
wasn't economic growth.
Germany was the richest.
Yes, absolutely.
the same of 1940 and 1950.
Yeah.
So, let's see,
So you could
so
say,
many
yes.
stupidities because of political
Yes.
stupidities.
I mean,
it's a stalemate.
Yeah. I've perhaps given a slightly misleading picture because there is debate going on in China at the top, and it's been quite interesting recently. We've got two men, one called Bo Xilai, who's the son of the Mao's finance minister, who I talked about swimming, and he runs Chongqing, which is a city of 32 million people out in Sichuan, even bigger than Sao Paulo. It's not a city, it's a region that's been set aside. And he is just for go for growth, state-run growth. He attracts foreign companies, giving them more or less free land, 10-year tax holidays. It's the biggest boom place I've ever seen, and he's aiming at 12% annual GDP growth. And there's an argument, but it isn't made very often, but it's clearly there, between him and Wang Yang, who runs Guangdong, which is the most richest, most populous, most advanced province, and who recently has been saying we shouldn't just talk about GDP growth. 7 to 8% is quite enough. We can do that. We've got to think about the nature of growth. We've got to think about society. We've got to think about the migrant workers. He's the kind of new, I won't say new left, because that's another meaning in China, but the more social left. And there are that is an argument which will be going on, because both of them will be in the Standing Committee of the Politburo there. The comparison with Germany, I mean, that is certainly true. I mean, I think from a geopolitical point of view, it's different. Whatever you think of the causes of the First World War. And China needs peace for the economy.
But so did Germany.
So did Germany, although, yes, it went wrong. Yes.
Could you please comment on the Chinese long-term challenges and, how can avoid to which point the economic reforms? And also, is there anything similar to public opinion research in China?
Yes. The long-term challenges, well, I spoke about some. I mean, the fact that you haven't got private ownership of land, and farming is inefficient as a result. Labour movement, all the things I mentioned there. If China doesn't address those, this isn't for this year or next year, but around, say, 2015 and then on, that starts to be a real, potential break on growth. The demographics in China will get old before it gets rich, because fewer young people, so there are these huge challenges. Whether they're going to work out or not, it depends entirely on the willingness of the new leadership, and we have very little idea. And there are so many counterbalancing interest groups in China now, which are all make themselves felt and are quite important. On public opinion, they carry out an enormous number of opinion surveys in China. They're going on all the time, and some of them are enormous, 10 million people and so on. And for my book, I got about 50 of these, and one opinion poll is worth what it's worth, but if you put 50 together, you get an idea. And there you see a society, and these are often official Communist Party or government polls, people who are very worried. They're worried about their own situation. They feel vulnerable. They feel that they are not getting a sufficient share of the growing national wealth, and that the rich and corrupt are getting rich and corrupt too fast. Great anger about corruption. Worry about housing, with housing prices. Worry about health, the cost of healthcare, because there's no efficient national health service, so healthcare is...
Yes, and about this, the social security,
yeah.
the construction of this...
It's being done. There's a 10-year program which will produce a health service, but it's being done in a very Chinese way, very slowly, and very methodically. They start with tests in 3 provinces. If it works, they expand that to 10 provinces, then they make it national. They start by building clinics in every village, so you have to do the construction. Then you train the nurses, train the doctors, get the equipment, do generic medicine. All this is a very slow, rolling process there. But, I mean, to come back to you, it's a worried society. They don't, a lot of them do, but you have to look, I mean, a lot of them are in slightly specialist, not specialist in the sense of particular interest magazines. A family magazine will do a survey on what people think of families. A magazine for old people will do a survey. So, but you can put them all together, and I've done 2 or 3 pages in my book pulling all this together, and what you get is an impression of a society which is really quite nervous about itself among the middle-aged and older people, and among younger people, you have a mixture of the materialism I talked about. These people, aged in their 20s and early 30s, they've never known a bad time. It's always been growth for them. It's always been, you buy an apartment and it's worth double the amount 4 years later. That's how you make money in China. It's always been, you can hop to a new job. Tremendous job changing, job hopping in China. And that is starting to be less the case. And those people are more and more worried. One of my colleagues says, society, life is becoming more and more hollow, is the phrase that she uses for that. You have 4 million university graduates unemployed this year, in 1 year, 4 million unemployed. And we know the dangers of having a number of highly educated, underemployed young men and women about. You've got the demographics that I was talking about, which are wrong. You've got the gender disparity, 100 young men for 70 young women, because of abortions and killing, infanticide young women, which actually is rather good for young women in China, because there's what's known as the bride price.
I had a daughter.
I have a friend in Suzhou who does this. He's American, married to a Chinese, and he charts the lavishness of the wedding banquets, which are going up and up and up. And then, of course, you say, "You want to marry my daughter? You have got a job, haven't you? And you have got an apartment. And I hope you've got a car." So, they are riding in the back of a BMW. But on the other hand, there is the argument, and a German historian has done a lot of work on this, that in periods where you get that kind of gender imbalance, the young men turn very aggressive. It said Japan, during the period of its expansion, there was that kind of expansion. So those people say, those analysts say, China is going to expand and will send all the young men into war. The other side says, oh no, if you've got 100 million people aged over 80, as China will have in 2020, they'll be very peaceful. They will all just want to sit in old folks' homes. But, sorry, the final thing I should say, this is a joke on this, a bad joke, but with the number of surplus young men, trusted sources, most of our clients are financial institutions, investment funds, and so on. And I was in New York, and one man came to see me from a hedge fund, and he said, "Now, what's all this about the demographics in China?" So we talked about it for a while, and he said, "Porn. Porn. I'm going to get into porn in China." I said, "Good luck."
Any other questions?
Grace. Oh, wait.
Grace, how are you? Good. Do you have any questions?
You don't have to.
Questions.
I have another question. Why did China go down in the 17th century?
The Great Disjuncture, yes.
Karl Marx says they exported things and didn't import. They just accepted gold. So you have to go to hoarding gold.
Gold and silver.
It's nothing.
Yeah.
So you have to get the inflation, you have to get the capacity. Are they doing the same thing today? Exporting and importing?
China, well, first of all, because the myth that China retreated from the world and closed itself in was never true. It wasn't always with Europe, but there were always connections with the Middle East, with Persia, Iran, lots of movement around. But you had the great admiral who went out under the Ming dynasty, Shang He, and they stopped that because basically the emperors always thought China was the centre of the world. It didn't need to go out. It wasn't so much they were hostile to the rest of the world, they felt self-sufficient. And up to, in 1800, the calculation is that China accounted for 1/3 of the world's wealth. You can dispute that. I mean, there are various people who don't count the records of what that have been done on that, including, I think, Fang Gang has done some work in saying that David Lee was his successor in the monetary committee, has done work. But there's no doubt that China, first of all, China did not innovate in the way that the West did during the Industrial Revolution, because they had what's called, they were caught in what economists, equilibrium track. That's say you've got enough to feed yourself, and you don't need to go into industry, etc. Secondly, and now we get into historical, you can argue about these different things. One of the problems in China is everything's in the wrong place. And you had some industry, the people called the self-strengtheners, tried to set up some industrialization in the later 19th century, but all the coal was back in Inner Mongolia and Shaanxi, and you couldn't get it to the coast where the factories were. Thirdly, you didn't have a capitalist money system in China. There was no banking system. The banking system was run from Shaanxi, where you were, near Xi'an, way back there, and it was a series of kind of chits that you took around. There was no proper banking system until around 1880, 1890 in China. The most controversial thing, you could say there wasn't a middle class in China. You were stratified by Confucian. You were a farmer, a scholar, and bottom. The bottom stratification was a merchant. And there were monopolists, like along the Grand Canal. You were talking about the salt merchants on the Grand Canal were the richest people in China, and it was always said they showed off their riches by having breakfast at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. They didn't have to get up early. So there was no middle class pushing for that. Fourthly, fifthly, the imperial system, like the Communist Party today, was very good at co-opting people who might have been the entrepreneurs. They all became civil servants. The ultimate thing in Imperial China was to pass the third stage of the Imperial Civil Service exam to become a mandarin, and you were made for life, and your family was made. You didn't go into commerce or business. So there were all those reasons. Some people would say it's because there was never a Protestant religion, but that's what's it called? That's Eugene Weber. That's Eugene Weber. China is not a religious country.
I'd like you to talk about your new book. Can you tell us?
Well, I can tell you what it is. The title is, which may seem a rather strange title, but it's a Chinese saying, is tiger head, snake tails. And it means somebody who's big and strong up there, but when you look down, they've got lots of problems. And that's China, I think, today. It seems all surrounded, then you've got all the problems underneath it. And it's an attempt in 380 pages to pull together and cover China today. So it's got the politics, economics, society, international relations, history, regional material, travels in China. There's not much culture. There's no culture in it. I can't cover Chinese culture. And there are a lot of very excellent books on China that have come out in the last 5 to 10 years, some of which I mentioned, like Richard McGregor's, on specific subjects. But this is an attempt to produce a one-stop book for the intelligent general readers, such as I hope yourself, who want to start somewhere in China, who want to know more about China, but don't want to read a book on migrant workers, a book on the Communist Party, a book on the environment, a book on the economy, a book on the Liberation Army, and so on. So I'm aware that I will have left out a lot of things. I sent the last proofs to the publishers to drive them mad. I kept rewriting it up to the last minute, just before I left London to come here. And I already sent 3 emails from here saying, if you could just move this in, if you could just, because things keep happening, which I want to put in, it's up to date. It's coming out in April, but so it's a quick job there. And I begin the book by saying, I should make clear who this book is not written for. It is not written for China experts who follow China every day, although I hope they'll read it. So I'm waiting to see the first of my friends in the China watching community who says, very strange that Mr. Fenby hasn't mentioned this point or that point, but in 380 pages there's a limit.
Just a question about, you spoke about the younger generation in China and the disparity between the young and old population and the different paradigms of thought there.
Yeah.
And you mentioned a couple of things about material wealth and desires and different kind of desire and access to information in the internet. How much have you looked at the education system?
Not enough. I must admit I haven't. I've been. That was one of the areas I'd like to have spent much more time on, but I just frankly didn't have time to look into that. But education has obviously become much more available in China, but state education is still quite primitive. And if you can afford to, you send your children to a private school, or you do private tutoring show us a project, and he was looking after several villages, and I got the distinct impression that he was planning to level these villages because he was going to build a theme park there. I don't think his motives were all charitable, but he'd become the kind of godfather benefactor, and he was sponsoring a local school, and we went to visit it, and all the pupils were in white tracksuits with English sport written on the back in English. And when I arrived in the class, they all shouted, "Hello, welcome," in English. And it was very impressive. And if I left, I'd said, "This is incredible, you know, village school." They all bust into the school. So that. But as soon as you said a word in English, they didn't have the slightest idea what I was talking about. So they'd all been schooled to say, "Hello, welcome," there, and so on. Although one of them did say, I said something about Britain, coming from Britain, and the child about 14, 15 replied, "China best." There was a kind of nationalistic. So I don't know, but there's a lot of rote learning in China. And China, for instance, at the higher levels, now has an enormous number of university students. That's important. But as I say, an awful lot of them don't have jobs because in terms of jobs, they're doing the wrong thing.
American universities in the Arab nations and in Asia have been benefiting from a growing popularity and a growing appreciation due to the fact that they welcome questioning of authority.
Absolutely, yeah.
Right.
That's happened with with English schools. Some English public schools, Dulwich, Harrow, various others, have set up in China.
So they do allow that in China.
Yeah, they allow it, but this is for people who can afford it.
Sure.
So you know, it's the relative sort. And then quite a lot of Chinese from the upper middle class and the real elite, they're educated abroad. They go to Australia, they come to Britain. I'm sure it's so in other places, but in Britain, at the London School of Economics, the Chinese are the second biggest national group after Americans there. And English universities, if you talk to them, are increasingly depending on Chinese paying fees to come. It's become a very important thing. And for instance, Bo Xilai, who I mentioned, who runs Chongqing and who has launched a great patriotic campaign. Everybody has to be proud of being Chinese and sing patriotic songs. Where did his son go to school? Harrow in England, followed by Oxford, and he's now at the Kennedy School at Harvard. And he drives a red Ferrari. So, yeah. But I told then technical, just going on with this, the PhD. I mean, Chinese now have lots and lots of PhDs, but they're pretty poor quality and not very innovative. What you have on the side is a number of, let's say, in Beijing, you pay, depends how much, and you can get a diploma that you have a PhD from a non-existent American university that sounds rather like Harvard. And 2 ministers were found to have these.
Juliana had a question. Juliana? Oh, slip up my mind.
Slipped your mind. You've got another day with me.
When we're traveling in the interior, we travel, with this young man who is helping us, and he was saying that China is surrounded by enemies. To what extent is this a deep cultural trait?
It is. I mean, it's exact that we come back to the century of humiliation, that China has been pillaged by the foreigners and has to, stand up for itself. China can stand up again, as now like to say. Well, I said I don't think that is entirely right thing, but the encirclement argument is always there in China, and it's above all, it's the Japanese, of course, and Taiwan, although less so now, and the tensions are off Taiwan, but Taiwan was seen as a still a Japanese colony, basically. It's India now, because there's a lot of tension with India, but above all, it's Vietnam, who's always had very scratchy relations with things, but it's also the presence of the US fleet in the seas there, and China's been building up its navy considerably. You get reports occasionally in the States about China's navy is going to rival that of the United States, which is completely rubbish. American naval presence, the presence of American troops in South Korea and Okinawa, and what's called the island chain, which goes from Okinawa to Taiwan down to the Philippines, which on a map is shown by the Chinese as encirclement of China there. So they want to burst through that, but it's used by the government for really to whip up nationalism when they feel that is politically necessary. I don't think there's going to be a World War III. There'll be clashes, there are a lot of maritime clashes all the time, and the comparison with Wilhelmine Germany is used that this is...
I think there's another thing that I knew that most anti-Americanism was with the elites who studied in America.
Yeah.
Because they were the king in their village, they go to America, they're considered as everybody else. That's a shock to the guys, and they keep that shock for the rest of their lives.
Well, that's not so in China.
It's not so in China.
Well, two things happen. First of all, 60 or 70% of the Chinese who study abroad don't go back to China. They stay abroad. They stay in Silicon Valley rather than Dubai. But those who do go back to China, they don't resent. They're not resentful of America. It's the kind of old Communist Party apparatchiks more who will trot out.
But all these rich French socialists who studied in the United States are against Germany. In Sweden, you have in Czechoslovakia.
Yes.
I'm sorry, just a quick, of the 30% that...
Sorry, I can just finish one other thing. The Chinese worry about America, about American naval power, is that China is very poor in raw materials. And the vital geographical spot for China is the Malacca Straits. 60% of its imports come through the Malacca Straits. And you will talk to Chinese officials, and they say, of course we have to develop the Navy. What would happen if terrorists took over the Malacca Straits? They don't mean that at all. They mean, what would happen if the American Navy blockaded the Malacca Straits in a fight? And, that's what they're afraid of.
They're right.
Of course.
They're the only ones who are not attacked by Somali pirates are the Russians and the Americans, because they can fight.
Yes.
The others are not able to keep a gun.
Sorry, you were going to say?
Yeah, no, just a quick question. Of the 30% or so that come back to China after going to foreign universities, do you have any idea what percentage of that 30% goes into the private sector or the public
Most go to the private sector of some form or other, although less so now, because the state sector has expanded greatly in China in the last 10 years, 15 years, I said. And increasingly there are good jobs for them at senior level. I mean, two of the chairmen of the 4 big state banks were educated abroad. They are princelings, they're the sons of the thing. So you can go back and get a good job, but a lot are still in the private sector. They job hop. I saw something, one of the surveys from a consultancy. I think the people, 25% of Chinese overseas educated who work in the private sector change their job within 2 years. They're jumping about and they're using it to go out there. They're known as sea turtles who come back. Sea turtles.
Right.
And turtles aren't much. Sorry, it's one of the rudest phrases in China to be a turtle's
What
egg.
is that?
A turtle's egg is one of the rudest things, and these people are known as sea turtles. They're kind of elided with, they're not very. And I'm told, this is just anecdotal, basically, they often don't settle in very well in China because Chinese companies are quite stratified and they come in with Western management ideas, and the whole management issue of China, partly because of the power of the Communist Party still in big state companies in the state. A man called John Welch, who used to run dean of the London Business School, has gone to Shanghai. There was an interesting interview with him in the Financial Times the other day. He said that the management gap in China is going to be one of the biggest problems in the economy. They just don't have enough qualified managers who can operate globally. And you sometimes see that when you talk to them. They're state-owned enterprises in China have a charmed life because they get cheap capital, and if you keep, you're moving up a kind of political, bureaucratic one day you'll be number 3 in a mobile telephone company, China Mobile. The next day you'll be number 2 in an oil company. There's no competences. It's a political thing more than it's a different kind of game. And if you come in with Western management ideas and techniques, you may not be very popular or not stay very long.
Well, thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. And what can I say? I hope you read my book.